Mr. Wilson told the police and the prosecutor that he never intended to hit Mr. Raffret, that he was firing a warning shot to de-escalate the situation. And he actually negated what would have been his best defense in court. He was not allowed to use it. In the course of my handgun instruction, which is mainly people that are entirely new to shooting, I always get asked certain questions, and one of the big ones is, where do I stand, or importantly, where does the law stand on the concept of warning shots? Well, I'm going to tell everyone right now it's a bit of a paradox. So the easiest way I think to proceed is to kind of break it down into two parts. First part is why tactically it's an incredibly bad idea, and why legally it's probably even a worse idea than that. It's not something you want to do, and not something that most firearm professionals condone in any way, shape, or form. Tactically, what's the problem with it? Well, they're not going to be in any specific order of importance because they're all equally important, so I'll just hit you with the high points. Number one is that it actually could show, one, that you have time to shoot the gun with a warning shot means your life wasn't in danger to begin with. You sort of sacrifice the concept of self-defense when you do that. And very, very important. Along with that, what you're actually saying is that I have the gun out, but may or may not need to defend my own life. So let's back up a little bit and talk about what the threshold is for bringing the gun out. One is immediate and imminent loss of life or severe bodily harm. That's the only time that your gun should ever be visible. That's it. Some people claim the idle principle, which we've talked about before on the channel, which is in defense of life, is the only time that your firearm should be out and visible to the public, let alone go off as some scare tactic. Speaking of scare tactics, it's not ever really been proven that it actually does what people think it's going to do. In some cases, it actually convinces the bad guy that you're not very inclined to use the gun on them and actually escalates the confrontation further. Another aspect of doing that was, on the other side of that coin, is he could reasonably infer that you're trying to kill him, especially if you've made a fact mistake and he's standing there with a cell phone, not a knife or a gun. You could actually be inviting trouble on yourself that wasn't there in the first place by firing the gun. Another issue, totally relevant, is you own whatever comes out of your firearm until it hits the ground. And everything that leaves the muzzle of your gun has a lawyer and or a lengthy prison sentence attached to it. So if you innocently enough try to fire a warning shot because you think that's the proper thing to do, and somebody else gets hurt, you're on your way to a lengthy prison sentence. Also, in certain jurisdictions, and we'll talk about that in part 2, it's actually illegal. So back to the paradox. Not only are you giving away the element of surprise if you need that in your confrontation by firing the gun, now everybody knows where you are. Also, what you could be doing is reducing your ammunition capacity. If you're an everyday carrier of a revolver, you're now down to 5, 6, whatever the number is that you happen to have as maximum capacity, you no longer have. Also tactically a bad idea. So the high points are this. One, the only time the gun comes out is when your life or somebody else's life is in immediate danger. Two, warning shots don't really do what everybody thinks that they're going to do. And importantly, now we're going to move on to the second part, which is why this is an incredibly complex and bad idea from a legal standpoint. For the next part of this video, of course, we film our channel from Ohio. I'm going to use 2 relatively recent cases that illustrate why warning shots are a bad idea from a legal standpoint. The first one has just sort of resurfaced after about 18 months. The case involves a then state representative, Michael Rulli, and his wife, Kelly. Michael is currently running for a vacated Congress seat for the U.S. House, And it may or may not be true that that's why all of these sort of facts have come up in the last 18 months. So we go back 18 months. What happened was he owned some property out into the country that, of course, the next field over, and we'll try to give you an app, which is going to be important in a second, and kind of overlay so people can have an idea of exactly what went on and where the property lines actually were. Early one morning, he looks out his window and he decides that there's two people with flashlights on his property. He put his dogs in the house and he went out with a handgun. Now, accounts vary on what happened next, because the teenager that he found on his property was named Hayden Sabula, and he was with his then girlfriend. Hayden Sabula's story is that from hundreds of yards away, Michael Rulli fired some shots at him. It still remains to be seen how many shots were actually fired, but Michael himself in court documents referred to shots, not single. Hayden Sabula's version of events were that one, he was hunting on his uncle's property, only with a bow. He did in fact say that he had a shotgun, which was always in his truck. Michael Rulli refutes that statement and said he was armed at the time. And interestingly enough, Sabula says that all of this happened hundreds of yards away. That's significant because obviously hundreds of yards away, you don't really need a warning shot. And this is another reason why you would really not want to fire a warning shot, is for all Mr. Rulli knows, that's going to entice Hayden Sabula to fire back. He could reasonably come to the decision that that guy just fired at me and I don't know why. Now it's time for me to defend my life. Yeah, over several hundred yards is probably not going to be real effective, but you can see how even while trying to de-escalate a situation, you actually might be escalating it. Rulli's version of events are that this confrontation happened within 15 yards, was very close, especially on a several acre property. He fired some warning shots and obviously the kid and his girlfriend took off. Oddly enough, that evening, after deciding that that property was too dangerous for him to hunt on, he went back to collect his tree stands where he encountered Michael's wife, Kelly Rulli, who did the exact same thing. Fired some warning shots off into the dirt and in an attempt to scare the young man off. Now, here's what I can tell you about all of the research I've done on this case, and I've gotten every bit of this either from court documents or from reliable print media. The Ohio Division of Natural Resources investigated both events, both versions of events, as well as a special prosecutor assigned to the case because of Michael's standing as a state representative. They determined that one, his actions were reasonable based on the facts, and that two, because he was on his own property, he was allowed to shoot into the dirt. And what's important about that is that we understand that's the only reason why Michael Rulli is not in jail, and his wife Kelly. You cannot behave that way out in public. It's simply against the law. Before we continue, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not giving anybody legal advice. Depending on the state and the jurisdiction you're in, those are going to change, obviously. But in this case, what kept him out of jail wasn't really some political home cooking like some people could infer. It was based entirely on the fact that one, he was on his own property. Important. And the second one is that the prosecutor and the Division of Wildlife simply believed his version of events more. Now, that's important because that's never something that you want to risk your liberty on. Is one, law enforcement or a prosecutor's opinion or their perception of you and what happened. And that's almost always what it comes down to, is who do they believe the most when there's not a lot of evidence laying around pointing one direction or the other. In most cases, that would have led Michael Rulli to a lengthy prison sentence. As it stands right now, 18 months later, they're still talking about the case. He's still dealing with it all throughout his political career. This is a good illustration of why warning shots, even if nobody gets hurt, are a bad idea. He opened himself up to criminal prosecution, and even though he was successful in sort of beating the case, It could have ended his political career and certainly been catastrophic in his personal life. It's nothing short of a miracle that both of them got away with it on the same day. Once again, nothing short of luck and never anything that you want to rely on related to your liberty. So we'll try to put a link to the special prosecutor's report if you want to dive into these facts further. And they are kind of interesting, like I said, based on the fact that two separate instances on the same property with the same people usually results in some form of prosecution. On to case number 2. This case is in front of the Ohio Supreme Court as we speak. It's actually become a very complex and sort of paradoxical way of looking at warning shots. So Springfield, Ohio, an individual named Tyler Wilson was at a gas pump. He did not own the car that he was sitting in. It was owned by somebody else who happened to be in the car as well. And while sitting at the gas pump, a tree service truck with a trailer drives by, driven by a Mr. Raffet. Tyler Wilson decided that Mr. Raffet's truck and trailer was too close to his car, and they got into a verbal altercation. At that time, Mr. Raffet backed up and got window to window and close enough that Tyler Wilson could not exit the vehicle if he wanted to. Versions vary on who said what to who. Tyler Wilson claimed that Mr. Raffet threatened to shoot him even though he did not have a gun at the time. For whatever reason he did it, Tyler Wilson pulled out his handgun, stuck it out the window, and fired a shot into Mr. Raffet's vehicle. Tyler Wilson then took off, and he was followed by Mr. Raffet in what the cops referred to as a high-speed chase. Not sure how high speed it can be with a landscaping truck, but that's in a quote. Now, before we go any further, let's analyze a couple of things that just went on here, okay? One, if you have the ability to drive away, you should. Simple. The gun doesn't need to come out, and we certainly don't need to be firing the gun in anywhere close proximity to another human being. Totally an irresponsible and illegal act. Now, oddly enough, let's look at Mr. Raffet's behavior. What person, after being shot at by an armed man, decides to follow him? That's not rational behavior. What he should have done was call law enforcement and let them deal with it, which he ultimately did, either while chasing Mr. Wilson or sometime in the immediate aftermath. When law enforcement caught up to Tyler Wilson, he was charged with a couple of counts of felonious assault and the big one, attempted murder. The reason why I'm telling you this sort of information to me is nothing short of fascinating, because when the case initially went to court, Mr. Wilson was denied a self-defense by the judge, because according to Ohio statute, self-defense is the intentional firing of a weapon to preserve your life or someone else's. Mr. Wilson told the police and the prosecutor that he never intended to hit Mr. Raffet, that he was firing a warning shot to de-escalate the situation. And he actually negated what would have been his best defense in court. He was not allowed to use it, which is the reason why the case is now up at the Ohio Supreme Court. There are a lot of people that do not agree with that. We'll see what the Ohio State Supreme Court says pretty soon, I'm sure, because they've actually had this case for a while. Now, back to the paradox. Depending on the jurisdiction in the state that you live in, if you can meet the threshold of, I need to fire the weapon to preserve my life, it's actually more legal to fire at a person than it is to fire a warning shot. Part of the case going on in front of the Supreme Court is that it seems that the law is written to encourage you to shoot at people instead of warn them. Interesting way to look at it. One of the things that I would like to focus on is basically this. One, there was never an original need for Tyler Wilson to pull the gun out and shoot it anyway. Drive away. Simple. The gravity of pulling the gun out and discharging it is enormous, and people need to understand that. even if you're involved in a justifiable shooting, you're going to suffer years and years of legal, possibly criminal, and certainly civil bills and discord. It's going to be the worst day of your life. Yes, it's better than being dead. I totally believe that people have the innate right to self-defense. But is it really self-defense if you have time to fire a warning shot? In my humble opinion, no, it isn't. People ask all the time, or they do this little experiment about, well, if a mob's coming down the street and I fire a warning shot and that disperses them, isn't that better than shooting people? Yes, in that simplistic view, it might be. But the issue is this: what if it doesn't? It could actually escalate a situation that wasn't there to begin with, as we've covered before. So, point of fact is this: they're never a good idea. They never have been, and they never will be. Please, if you're a gun owner, divorce yourself from the idea that you're going to warn anybody and get out of a potentially bad situation. The only time you reach from the gun is when the situation is already not recoverable and loss of life is imminent. Once again, idle principle, in defense of life only. For you young hunters out there, we're going to try to list some apps that you can use to check property blinds, ownership, so there's never an excuse for you not to know what property you're standing on. Never. The apps are excellent. You can find out all kinds of information on them quite quickly. And even if you're just going to cut through somebody's property on the way to one you're allowed to be on or own, never a good idea. Don't trespass, and it will automatically de-escalate the situation. Thanks for your time. I hope you found this interesting, and we'll catch you next week.